What if I told you one of the deadliest weapons of World War II didn't fire a single shot? It didn't explode. It didn't fly. It wasn't even built for war. It was a simple metal can, stamped with the words "Spam, made in America." While Hitler believed his greatest army was marching towards certain victory, thousands of these ordinary food cans were quietly crossing frozen rivers, railways, and Arctic oceans. Months later, Germany's most feared army would be starving. Entire divisions would disappear. More than 290,000 soldiers would become trapped inside a frozen city from which almost no one escaped. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, the sound of an American can opener would become louder than the sound of German victory. This is the incredible true story of how one tiny tin helped change the course of World War II forever. If you enjoy true World War II stories backed by history, not myths, make sure to subscribe. It helps us bring you more forgotten stories like this. Now, let's see how a simple food can become part of Germany's greatest military disaster. January 17, 1942. A freight train rolls east through the Russian steppe, its wooden cars loaded not with men but with cases, row upon row of tinned Spam, condensed milk, powdered eggs, and Hershey bars stamped with the date code of an American factory in Chicago. Each can weighs less than a kilogram. Each can costs less than a rifle cartridge. None of them, yet, have reached the soldiers who will one day need them most. The train disappears into a horizon of white birch and silent snow. Somewhere far ahead, on the Volga, a city bears the name of a man whose face the men inside the train will never see. This is the story of how a single battle, fought over the bones of a city named after Stalin, destroyed the largest, best equipped, most decorated army Germany had ever put into the field. And how the sound of an American tin opener, repeated 7,000 times across a frozen landscape, became the loudest verdict of the war. To understand what happened at Stalingrad, one must first understand what was believed to be impossible in the summer of 1942. By June of that year, the Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 35 days. It had dismantled France in 6 weeks. It had torn through the Balkans and stood within sight of Moscow the previous winter. Generals in the German High Command had grown intoxicated with their own momentum. Hitler, a former corporal who had once slept in the mud of the Flanders trenches, now referred to the Soviet Union, casually, as a rotten structure that would collapse at the first serious push. The propaganda ministry in Berlin printed pamphlets declaring that Russia's armies were finished as a serious fighting force. The Reich's brightest strategists spoke of the Volga as the new eastern frontier of a Europe reshaped by German will. To doubt them was, by 1942, almost unpatriotic. This was the atmosphere in which Army Group South prepared for what was officially designated Case Blue, Fall Blau, the summer offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city clinging to the Volga. The spearhead of that offensive was the Sixth Army, commanded by a methodical, soft-spoken career officer named Friedrich Paulus. Paulus was not a Nazi firebrand. He was a cavalryman's son who had served the Imperial General Staff and then the Reichswehr with quiet competence. Over 4 years of war, his Sixth Army had been rebuilt, refitted, and tested so many times that by July 1942 it had become something close to the perfect German instrument. 300,000 men, seasoned by the campaign in France and the long grind in the East, equipped with the new Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, supported by the feared Stuka dive bombers of the Luftwaffe, and backed by an unbroken string of victories stretching from the Bug River to the Don Bends. Adolf Hitler himself, in moments of private confidence, called the Sixth Army his Shield of Europe. The expectation in the German barracks that summer was that Stalingrad would fall in a single, dramatic stroke. Officers spoke of taking the city before the first snow. Junior sergeants joked about riding home from the Caspian Sea by Christmas. Supply officers packed tropical kit for the Caucasus advance. The Sixth Army had fought its way across continents of farmland and steppe. A single city on a riverbank was, in the imagination of Berlin's planners, a small obstacle. What actually began on July 17, 1942 was the beginning of one of the longest, most violent urban engagements ever recorded. Across the broken brick and twisted steel of Stalingrad, Soviet troops of the 62nd Army under General Vasily Chukov refused to retreat. They fought from room to room, basement to basement, from the ruins of the Red October steel works to the shell-pocked slopes of Mamiev Kurgan. The Luftwaffe, which had promised to bomb the city into submission, dropped so much high explosive on the waterfront that observers reported the Volga itself boiling in places. Yet the Soviets kept crossing the river at night, in fragile fishing boats, hauling forward new rifles, new machine guns, and, buried deep in the hold of every supply barge, a strange new cargo, bright, rectangular tin stamped with the words, Spam, Hormel and Company, Austin, Minnesota. For the first months of the battle, the food of the two opposing armies offered almost no contrast. German field kitchens served ersatz coffee, dried sausage, and black bread. Soviet kitchens served millet porridge and whatever could be carried forward across the Volga, a thin stew thickened with machine oil grease when fuel ran low. The span tins, at first, were a curiosity, not a difference. The Americans, after all, were still officially a neutral nation in the summer of 1942. Pearl Harbor had pushed them into war in the Pacific, but Hitler had declared a separate peace on the Atlantic. And President Roosevelt had not yet persuaded a reluctant Congress to share the harvest of America's industrial farms with a communist ally. That was about to change. On September 19, 1942, 6 months to the day after operations in the East had first been suspended for the spring thaw, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Extension Act, sending an unending stream of American material into the Soviet Union. By the end of the war, Lend-Lease would deliver more than $11 billion of supplies, the equivalent of about $250 billion in modern purchasing power, to Moscow and Murmansk in the Persian Gulf. Among the tonnage, more than 400,000 American-built jeeps and trucks, 14,000 combat aircraft, 8,000 tractors, 13,000 tanks, and millions of individual ration tins of Spam, corned beef hash, powdered eggs, and sweetened chocolate. The can, stamped with its American place name, became the quiet, repeating heartbeat of the Soviet war effort. Every Soviet soldier who reached Stalingrad in those months had, somewhere on his belt or in his pack, an American tin. The Germans did not know it yet. They did not yet understand that the breadbasket of the world, the wheat fields of Kansas, the cattle ranches of Texas, the canning factories of Illinois, were now working nights for the Red Army. Their logistics, in the autumn of 1942, were stretched thin. The 6th Army supply lines ran back across the Don River, through Hungary and Romania, and dependence on Italian and Romanian Allied troops for the flanks had grown heavy and brittle. Yet Hitler pressed forward. His orders, in late September, were explicit: take the city, drive the Soviets into the Volga, and hold what had been taken at any cost. Paulus objected. His superiors overruled him. The 6th Army, against its better judgment, plunged deeper into the ruins. What the German soldiers expected, as autumn gave way to winter, was a quick triumph. What they actually experienced was the slow, methodical strangulation of an army. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a multi-pronged counteroffensive designed by Generals Georgy Zhukov and Nikolai Vasilyenko. They struck not at the city itself, but at the weak Romanian and Hungarian divisions holding the 6th Army's northern and southern flanks. Within 96 hours, the Romanians were shattered. Soviet armored columns linked up at the town of Kalikan-Don on November 23. The Volga and the Don were now connected by a single unbroken Soviet line. Inside the new cauldron sat the entire 6th Army, roughly 290,000 German soldiers, plus tens of thousands of Allied auxiliaries, trapped in a pocket 100 miles wide and 50 miles deep. The trap closed almost without warning. Wireless operators in Berlin received the urgent message simply, Kessel, Keldron. Inside the Keldron, the change began almost immediately. The temperature dropped far below anything the German quartermasters had modeled in their summer planning. By mid-December, thermometers on the cracked tarmac of Stalingrad's main runway registered -42 degrees Celsius. Bread froze solid within minutes of leaving the bakery. Eggs spun across the cutting board like coins. Machine oil congealed in rifle bolts and froze the mechanism shut. Soldiers learned to thaw their rations under their shirts, pressing tin cans against their skin for the few minutes of body heat required to loosen the contents. The Americans, those clever industrialists of the Midwest, had engineered a different challenge. Their tin Spam could be eaten cold, frozen, sliced with a knife like bread, or boiled in helmet water over a burning oil drum. It tasted the same in every climate. A German corporal named Wilhelm Hoffmann, a young man pressed into service with the 14th Panzer Division, kept a diary of these days, pages later discovered, dust-covered, in the ruins of his dugout. His entries from December 1942 read like a clock running down. "Food is becoming scarcer every day," he wrote on December 11th. "We have nothing for the sentries to eat at all. The area assigned to us is in a wretched state, and the Russians are giving us no peace day or night." A few days later, recording the Russian Christmas the soldiers had begun to fear more than any other date on the calendar, he wrote, "The flesh froze solid on the bones of the dead, and they could not be buried. They were stacked along the parapets like firewood." His last entry, dated mid-January 1943, was 4 words long. It ends with the line that has since been quoted across 100 histories of the war: disease, hunger, cold, and continual Russian fire. The Sixth Army had marched into Russia as the pride of Europe. By Christmas it was a population of starving men. The daily bread ration fell from 200 grams to 100, then to 50. Soup kitchens mixed sawdust into the broth. The Luftwaffe had promised to airlift a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day into the pocket. In practice, the figure never rose above 100 tons, and during weeks of cloud and Soviet fighter activity it collapsed to almost nothing. Göring, the Nazi air chief who had boasted he could keep the Sixth Army fed from the sky, made no public acknowledgement of his failure. The men in the cauldron, those who still had the strength, simply starved. The transformation in soul, during those last weeks inside the pocket, was as swift as the transformation in body. The vast, mechanistic, ideologically certain army of July 1942 was now a collection of small groups huddling around tin stoves. National Socialist ideology, with its slogans about racial superiority and eternal German triumph, was crowded out by a far more pressing question: will the bread truck come today? The Nazi dream of a 1,000-year empire was being weighed on the pocket scales of a ration tin. In the trenches, the symbol of the new reality was no longer the swastika armband but the unlabeled can of Spam passed from a Soviet prisoner by a sniper's grace to a starving German who would never otherwise have tasted it. Many men who walked out of Stalingrad as Soviet prisoners would later recall, in the strange post-war decades that followed, that their first full meal, the meal that pulled them back from death, was an American tin of canned meat flown in from a factory they had never seen, on a continent they had spent their lives being told was the enemy. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a promotion, the world understood, that carried with it an unspoken instruction: no German Field Marshal was to surrender. The new rank was, in effect, a method of suicide. Paulus received the news. He did not move. On January 22, 1943, the Soviet 7th Rifle Division cut the pocket into 2. On January 24th, Paulus transmitted his last message to the Führer: the army could not hold, could not move, and could not feed itself. He asked permission to surrender. Hitler refused. A week passed. On January 31, 1943, Paulus disobeyed direct orders and gave himself up to Soviet forces in the basement of the Univermag department store. 22 German generals surrendered with him that same day. 2 small radios in Berlin continued to broadcast operational orders to an army that no longer existed. The numbers of the catastrophe must be spoken carefully, because they described the end of an entire military formation, not merely a battle. Of the roughly 290,000 German soldiers who began the operation in the summer of 1942, around 110,000 were killed or died of wounds during the battle itself. Another 40,000 were killed in the months of marches that followed as prisoner columns were driven westward into captivity. Of the roughly 91,000 who entered Soviet captivity, The figure most consistently cited by historians from Anthony Beaver to Oleg Klevnik, only about 6,000 ever returned home. The rest, over 85,000 men, died of starvation, typhus, exposure, or were worked to death in the labor camps of the post-war Soviet Union. Axis losses across the entire southern sector of the Eastern Front in 1942–43 were estimated at close to 1 million men. Soviet losses, dead, wounded, captured, exceeded 1.1 million. Stalingrad remains, by every accepted measure, the deadliest battle in the long history of human warfare. And yet the loss did not destroy Germany. Hitler would raise another army, and another still, and the war would grind on for 2 more years. What Stalingrad destroyed was not the nation, but the myth. It was the first decisive, unambiguous, military defeat inflicted on the Wehrmacht in the field. It shattered the perception of Nazi invincibility upon which so much of the regime's domestic prestige had been built. It told the German people, in a language louder than any propaganda speech, that their armies could be encircled, starved, and compelled to surrender in their tens of thousands. The psychological turning point that followed Stalingrad, visible, immediately, in the slow shift of tone of Allied diplomats, in the cautious neutrality of Sweden and Turkey, in the growing confidence of partisan movements across occupied Europe, was, in its deepest sense, a cultural recognition that the ideology of blood and soil could be fed, weighed, and broken by the steady, daily output of an American canning line in Austin, Minnesota. The recurring symbolic object of this narrative, then, is the Spam tin. It appears first as freight on a January train. It appears again on Soviet supply barges crossing the Volga. It appears in German trenches traded by prisoners. It appears, finally, in post-war memory as the strange, sweet, faintly salty taste of the diet that defeated the largest army Germany had ever built. The symbol works because it is small. A tin of Spam weighs 340 grams and costs, in modern equivalents, about $3. The Sixth Army that had helped to break numbered almost 300,000 soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of horses and the entire industrial output of Nazi-occupied Europe. The arithmetic of that contrast is the entire moral of the war, written at the scale of a ration. Consider, in closing, what an American housewife in Chicago would have felt, cracking open one of those tins in her own kitchen that same winter of 1942. She would have read, in her morning newspaper, about an army destroyed on the Volga. She might not have known that the can in her hand, stamped with the date and the name of her city, would be served, within a few months, on the bread of a German prisoner who had once marched under a different flag. She would not have known that her daily work, the steady, democratic, unromantic work of feeding a nation, had quietly arranged the end of a regime that had told itself for a decade that the world belonged to the loudest and the most disciplined. The story of Stalingrad is, in this sense, not only a story of an army broken. It is a story of abundance defeating scarcity, of patience defeating frenzy, of the unheroic working rhythms of collective life defeating the heroic myth of an immortal master race. If you trace the threads of what happened at Stalingrad back to their roots, you find that the deepest cause of the Sixth Army's destruction was not the Soviet General Zhukov, brilliant as he was. It was not the winter cold, terrible as it was. It was not even the bravery of the Soviet soldier, devastating as that bravery was. The deepest cause was an industrial economy on the other side of an ocean that was already, in the silent language of tin food and stamped ration labels, providing more calories to the world than any single empire that the modern era had ever known. The king died on the Volga. But the tin came from Minnesota. And the smell of that tin, a faint, briny, faintly sweet American smell, would linger for decades in the memories of the few thousand men who aided in the ruins of Stagen City, and afterward walked into years of captivity, and afterward walked home, and tried to explain to wives and children what war had meant, and what war had ended, and why, of all the powerful sounds they remembered in those frozen weeks, the small, foreign, mechanical click of an American can opener had been the loudest.